Today, I'm happy to welcome my special guest, Bodhi B. Bodhi is a teacher, guide, and ordained Sufi minister. He is also an independent funeral director, hospice volunteer, end-of-life and bereavement counselor, ceremonialist, and the founder and president of The Death Store and the nonprofit organization Doorway into Light. In addition to all of that, he's the founder and director of the International Death Doula Certificate Training Program in Maui, which is going on its 4th year, and he lives on Maui as an organic homesteader as well. And Bodhi, I've been following your work for quite some time now, and so I'm so
Thank you.
honored that I have this opportunity to talk with you.
Fabulous. And same here. I've seen your name and some of your words show up in a number of places. So also very glad to kind of meet you in person, cyberly at least.
Yes, like we've been on our separate tracks that we're destined to cross today for this conversation. So I will point out, if anyone wants to learn more about Bodhi's work, his website is doorwayintolight.org. And we'll mention that again at the end. But I was hoping you'd start out by just telling us your story, Bodhi, and how you got started working with people at the end of life.
Well, yeah, my story, I don't know. The answer is I don't know. How something kind of has pulled me along and dragged me into this is the nutshell story. I could tell you a different part of that story, that certainly the sudden death of my father when I was 17, an experience I had at his graveside at a big cemetery in New York, certainly had a powerful effect on me. But skipping ahead, more recently in the 1990s, I'd already been I'm an ordained interfaith minister in a Sufi lineage, and have been doing spiritual psychological counseling for many, many years. And in the late 90s, people started approaching me about they were dying, or their friends were dying, or somebody had died and they were grieving. And I realized I didn't really feel qualified to support those people other than in a more general way as a spiritual counselor. So I decided to take hospice training and become a hospice volunteer. That in itself was quite a powerful experience, very transformative. Then hospice started sending me into homes to sit at the bedside of dying people. That was a completely new experience. That was going into neighborhoods I didn't normally go into communities and families I wouldn't normally necessarily connect with or relate with. And I was basically submerged into learning what it means to sit with dying people and learning how people are dying. So then I felt I was in the school of how do people die? How do they do it? Or refuse to do it in most cases, et cetera, et cetera. And wow, very powerful for me. Then as someone I've had a number of businesses, and so my business mind started looking at what's going on in that whole world of funeral industry, cemetery industry, casket making industry, and the institution of hospice itself, and what's happening with the hospice movement and what institutions, hospitals, assisted living facilities, to see what was actually going on out there. And of course, the funeral industry is a mega billion-dollar industry. Cemetery industry, same thing. Casket making industry, same thing. Those industries often employing quite toxic practices for the sake of making money. No surprise, really. Looking at the trends in hospice, that more and more hospices were for-profit hospices because of the amount of money in the Medicare insurance world and how hospice works. And then I got to see, firsthand, going into hospitals and going into assisted living facilities to sit with people. And again, as a business person and as a minister, kind of taking it all in, and recognized what a big gap. There was so much missing. There was so much missing in terms of, let's say, spiritual care. And of course, that's a loaded word because so many people have a different understanding of what that word refers to. I don't see anything as not being spiritual, but in terms of the frequency of wider, deeper understanding of who we are and what's going on out here was, except for a few Buddhist groups that were teaching about death and dying, I didn't see anything else going on, and thought, well, that's something I want to plug in there. And that was basically the, I'm sorry, I must have leaned on the printer. And then that's where Doorway into Light came into being, as a way to initially find out who in Hawaii was interested in coming together in community to explore aging, dying, and death in a let's say, revisiting it in a new way, to bring more consciousness and heart to the whole, to that whole field and to the conversation itself. I happened to be a neighbor of Ram Dass's, and was visiting with him one day and told him what we were up to, and he said he'd love to help. That's basically what he's been doing for the last 40 years in many ways. And so at that point, we decided to put on a 3-day event and invited a few other leaders in this field, and 100-something people came for 3 days, and exploring many of these questions and what's available, what's not available, where do we want to go with this. And that became the beginning of Doorway into Light. And Doorway into Light now, since that was 2006. So 2007, we started a monthly group called Being with Dying, which was kind of the prelude to Underwood's Death Cafe. In fact, he had called me up. He had heard we were doing and wanted to know what we were doing and how we were doing it. And so that's still going on. I think it's in its 12th year now. Hey, there's my wife right there. And we started putting on more events, bringing in more leaders in this field to Maui. We started organizing volunteers to sit at the bedside of dying people and working with those volunteers to bring more consciousness and love and heart and spaciousness, really. And the recognition that there's something deeper going on, and not just the story that's playing out, so that a dying person isn't just always seen as a dying person, but is seen as a soul and a being with that story playing out, and to be recognized as soul doing the work of completing a life and moving forward, and in maybe one of the most important, or the most important times in our life, really. That turned into, I looked around to see, is it okay that I go on like this?
Yes, yes.
And then I went to the funeral homes, the 2 funeral homes on Maui. I wanted to see the caskets, and the most inexpensive casket was $1,500, and it was made out of particle board from China with toxic glue. And I thought, well, I could make I'm a builder and a bit of a carpenter, and I could make a really sweet pine box casket and sell it for $400 or $500, and started making caskets. And then I found out if I didn't do any embalming, I could become a funeral director in Hawaii fairly easily, and decided I would do that. And then that was a process to get the state to train me and recognize me, and help me get into their system, really, because it's so much of it now is electronic. And then I decided to open up an office where I could provide my counseling services, showcase the pine box caskets I was building, and function as a funeral director and offer funeral director services. That led into home funerals. That led into a number of different directions. And then I was downtown. I wanted to see if I could rent a crematory from one of the funeral homes, that I would provide the funeral services and work directly with the families. And then I could contract and make an appointment to pay just for the cremation itself. And one of the funeral homes I went to looked at me and said, "You're a funeral director?" "Yes." "Are you recognized by the state of Hawaii?" "Yes, I am." "Do you sell caskets in your store?" I do. And he said, do you sell urns? And at the time I didn't sell urns. I sell beautiful handcrafted, beautiful made urns now. I could sell urns. And he looked at me and he said, well, you're a funeral home. You're competing with us. Goodbye. First of all, it was very short-sighted because I made an arrangement with the other funeral home that when people call me up to want to have someone cremated, I send them to the other funeral home that gives them a 10% discount because I sent them there. But the big thing was when he told me, oh, you're a funeral home, I had no idea we were a funeral home. So I went home to Leila, my wife, and I said, guess what? I have a funeral home. I mean, it was just like that. And I thought, wow, if I have a funeral home, I want to revolutionize and reinvent what a funeral home is, because too many people have lousy stories about going to the funeral home and being taken advantage of and being met with basically the same, I'm so sorry for your loss, and being handed brochures and price sheets that didn't really tell the whole story. And I thought, well, I want to pray for and with people, not upon people. And so then I thought, okay, so then my funeral home has a bookstore and a lending library and a reference library and lots of information and education. Besides me, there's another interfaith minister. There's a hospice volunteer who's there. There's another end-of-life and bereavement counselor who's there. I'm a notary. I became a bedside notary specifically so I could go to people's homes. They wouldn't have to get out of their dying bed to get their will notarized at the last minute, for example. So then I decided, well, I'm going to combine the funeral home with an educational resource center and store, and that became the death store. Even though most everybody I've talked to my age tried to talk me out of calling anything the death store, and I almost succumbed to the pressure, but fortunately, it's really the perfect name for it. And the death store in Haiku on Maui, a brick and mortar store, now getting a lot more visits and a lot more attention. As you know, we're kind of on the crest of this wave as people are starting to wake up to especially the boomers who've changed everything. And sure enough, the boomers have finally figured out they're going to die. We're going to die. We're seeing our parents dying, and now we're seeing our friends dying. And of course, we will change and are changing, as you know, as you're part of this death positive movement. In fact, I think one of the reasons why we're eating the world, is a phrase I use, eating the world, is our aversion, denial, and avoidance of the truth that we're going to die. And there's so much to that. I mean, we could spend a few hours just on that piece. So then we're the only nonprofit funeral home in the state of Hawaii. We're the only funeral home doing, we bury bodies directly in the ocean. I think we're the only funeral home doing real green burials in the few places we can. And that's been going on since 2012. We still have our monthly group meeting. We still put on workshops and trainings. I teach a course at the college. I've been teaching at the senior centers and making presentations at the Rotary clubs. And now my assistant's starting to do the very same thing. Then we started the International Death Doula training. And again, we're coming up on the 4th year. We brought in some great people, Jerry Grace Lyons and Amy Glenn and Deanna Cochran. And we've had Stephen Jenkinson and Zenith Virago, a number of people, and a few Hawaiians that are on my board who are very, very deep into the heart of what this is about. So we started a 5-day training, and then again, we're coming up on the 4th one next April. And then we added on a certification program that if you attend the 5-day training here on Maui, you can then join our 6-month training from wherever you live, where that's requiring, 90 hours of bedside sitting, filing reports that we send you on your experiences at the bedside. And then we meet just like this on a Zoom conference every month. and go over those reports together and everything else that's come up. And then we have a kind of a final exam summary, completion paper. And that's working really well. We've got some great people out there now who've had the certification training. And the obvious question is, well, what value does the Doorway into Light certification training have out in the world? And which is a great question. And the answer is, first of all, it's the value that BodhiBe and Doorway into Light have in the greater community in terms of what we represent out there. And the other end of what the value is how well we train you and what you then bring to your community. So it's how our certified death doulas show up in the community increases the value of what that certification is. And so far it's working out amazing. So maybe I'll let you break in here and see where you want to go with that.
Well,
I could go on. But.
I'm so glad that you shared the whole story, because looking at your website and all of the variety of things that you do and that you're offering, it all comes together when you tell the story and how everything evolved and grew organically because you were awake and you saw the gaps. You saw where something more was needed, and you were also willing to step forward and to do what you could to fill in the gaps. And it's a really great story of how you've met the needs on Maui, at least, of the people and your community. And that, I think, for me, I guess that's one of my visions, is that everyone, no matter where they live, would have that same ability to look around and spot what do we need here in my community, and how could I change that? What could I offer? And what could I do? And I think the death doulas you're training are probably very well equipped to go back to their own communities. And maybe they're not all actually serving as death doulas, but some of them might be so aware they're finding other ways, other needs where they can fit in. And
I think that's really our particular focus and goal. I'm not really into creating another field of specialist expert people. I'm really into empowering people to go and contribute to their communities and train people in their communities. So because this is for all of us. It's not for another group of whatever. It's for everybody to connect with that work. So our emphasis is to go into your community and see how you can bring value and support the people in your community to come closer to this work and engage in taking care of the dying and the dead. Very much so. I wanted to add that in case I'm not doing enough. I write a column called Ask the Death Professor for a Maui magazine, and I have a weekly radio show called Death Tracks that streams online every week, and we're going to turn part of that into a podcast. So I'm busy away.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know how you find the time and the energy for all of these things and how you keep track of all of it.
That's only one part of my life. I teach in the Sufi community, and then I have a beautiful wife that we share this beautiful land with, and we share it with 3 of our kids and 3 of our grandkids. And so we're gardening and taking care of land and homesteading and working on being a good grandpa. So there's a lot. I don't know how I do it all. And then I take on something new. And now it looks like I'm going to start a men's grief group here. So, hey, when I turned 60, I thought if my foot wasn't stepping all the way down on the gas pedal, I better step all the way down on the gas pedal. And that's part of being in this field, the awareness that I don't assume I have plenty of time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I love it that you're a perfect example of when you live and work from your passion, from your passionate heart, you are provided with the energy you need to get the work done that's there.
May that be totally so. May it be true.
I did want to say one thing, because whenever I do these interviews, I almost always ask people how they got interested in working in the end of life. And I've concluded that really we have all been called by death itself. It's as if death has reached out and inspired each one of us in our own way to step up. and do this work. And it feels like you were called at an early time, and really as a pioneer in some ways in this whole movement of of death awareness and death positivity, but so that you could be in place right now and have such well-established programs when they're desperately needed right now for, as you say, all the baby boomers who are waking up and ready to learn about death and dying.
Not just the baby boomers. Now I'm connecting with a lot of people under 40 who are, let's say, on the more awake end of the spectrum, who are gravitating for something that's real and meaningful and deep. Big work.
Yeah, definitely. Well, one thing also that you said that I would love to talk with you more about, you talked about bringing the spiritual aspect into death and dying. And for me as a doctor, I've always had spiritual awareness, and I always felt that I was a spiritual doctor, that my medical practice and my work as a doctor arose from my own spiritual orientation. And yet I've had great frustration with my profession because spirituality is so often dismissed or even looked at as quackery or something that's not important. And even in hospice, I've had hospice workers tell me, oh, people don't really need a chaplain visit. We don't really need to pay attention. That's not the most important thing. So I was so happy that you mentioned spirituality, which is different things to different people, how elemental it is to who we are as beings here on the planet. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit more with you.
Well, in my world and in my experience, in my embodiment, that spiritual piece we're speaking to is the core of every other piece. That's the foundation for psychological, emotional, and physical care. That the core of that is our spiritual realization, embodiment. And you talked about calling, and so I actually teach quite a bit about calling, and it's very much a part of the doula training on Maui, because what exactly is a calling? Where is it coming from? And what does it ask of us? What is the responsibility of being called? And that's very big. I mean, that itself, if a calling as something coming from something outside of us, which is different than, let's say, I've had businesses where I was out to make things happen and it was coming from me. As much as I asked for guidance and to be led, a calling is really about being pulled, in my experience, because now I know what a calling is. I never would have imagined I'd be a funeral director, and I don't even know where it's going from here on out at all. So where's the calling come from? And if it's something bigger that maybe is in the category of mystery or wonder or magic, and the willingness and the trust and the confidence to follow it, and to know when it's speaking in whatever wordless ways it guides us, either in insight or intuition. Well, that calling requires tremendous amount of listening skill, deep listening. And of course, as you know, a deep listening is a profoundly important piece at the bedside of the dying and anybody else. And in fact, the living, because most people in this culture are lousy listeners, and many people have the wound of not being listened to. In fact, oftentimes the loudest person in the room has that wound. So the deep listening to hear the call and what the call is asking, and of course the responsibility to be willing to trust and follow what is being asked, even when it flies in the face of who I think I am in this moment and what I think I'm supposed to be doing. So a calling itself denotes something that I would refer to often as sacred. And I often refer to the work of being with dying people as sacred service. At the core, whether it turns into career or whatever, at the core of it is sacred service. And that comes back to a Buddhist term, which is bodhicitta, which is pure intention. What is the purest intention to bring to this work? right? And that needs to be bigger than the conscious and unconscious shadow of, well, I want to be loved, I want to be valued, I want people to see me, I want to finally feel like I'm doing whatever it is, right? The conscious and unconscious pieces. And underneath that needs to be a great wish, a great prayer to be of service, to be useful, to give freely, and to basically be a vehicle for the holiness itself to express through us. And what a better place, and what a maybe the most important place, at the bedside of the dying and with the families of the people who are dying. So spiritual is big, especially in my world where I don't believe in mundane. Mundane is a strange concept that was, I believe, created by the Catholic Church to denote that God wasn't here, that God was somewhere else, and this is all mundane and not worth the effort. And you go home when you die, and that's a very toxic understanding, really, if you think about it. And that's been very big for me, because I understand the sentiment of grandma's going to go home. I do understand what people are speaking to, but the wording itself denotes that home is somewhere else, that it's not here. And that's a very big thing when we look into that, because if millions and millions of people don't think home is here, that's very much likely why the world is the way it is. This is just a hotel we're just passing through. It's not worth the effort, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the spiritual piece, in terms of who do we think, who are we? Who are we? And is it true that the holiness resides inside of us and wants to work through us and is working through us, if we can have a clear and bright and fresh heart and a clear and bright mind, that the spirit, the holiness, wants to work through us. So that's a piece of what I talk about spiritual. We have to be in totally. We can't be a concept or a notion about spiritual or soul. If we want to connect with the soul of a dying person, then we have to live in that place where soul is a real thing to us.
Exactly. We have to be an embodied soul that presents to the patients that we're working with. Let's see, something came to my mind, and now it slipped out of my mind of what I wanted to ask you about. Well, in some ways, you mentioned hospice, so many hospices now becoming for-profits, and I've been watching this over the last few decades, of almost feeling as if hospice in some way has gone off the rails a little bit. And I feel like some of the spiritual aspect of hospice care, because I used to view hospice as the one part of medicine where it's okay to be spiritual and it's okay to view it as sacred, the work as sacred. And I see it being lost in some ways, which is alarming and really frightening to me to see that happen. And it almost feels as if hospice is being swallowed up by the medical system and the medical industry. And I don't know if that's what you've observed as well.
Well, I'm very close to the oldest hospice here on Maui. And there's a few things that I've seen. One is the people that started the hospice movement in the 70s, more or less, were completely volunteering. It was their heart's wish. They saw that big hole, just like we're seeing what's out there now. They saw this big gap. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross opened a door to this whole world that people jumped into, that were already people who wanted to help alleviate suffering, compassionate people that recognized that dying people weren't really getting everything they needed. And so those people are now in their 70s and 80s and are moving out of the hospice movement. And a lot of what's coming into the hospices now are people on a career path. And certainly all the hospice nurses I meet are phenomenal people. To be a hospice nurse is no small thing, but it brings a different energetic. Also, the hospice on Maui used to have 20 or 30 patients a month caseload, and now has 80 or more. And so they have way more nurses, and it's become a much more of a business, to where I think people in the hospice don't all even know each other, kind of thing. And on top of that, the insurance companies have forced the nurses to spend more and more time chronicling on the computer to basically explain why Medicare should give them any money. So they're now having to spend more and more time on the computer and less time with the patient. So then I see that there's another hospice that came into town, and so all of a sudden, this nonprofit hospice that I've been working with for 20 years has to spend more money to market so more people know about their services in the community. So of course, given the budget that they have to take the money to market from somewhere else. And most often, and I'm guessing in most hospices, the money comes from the end of the table where the chaplain and the spiritual care coordinator sit, because that's considered, in general, not always, the least important piece, as you've addressed. So all of those pieces are kind of, and yes, it's being eaten up, again, because one, so much government and insurance money, which means so much government insurance control. Now I see the sun's rays kind of moving across your face.
Oh, yes, they are.
It's kind of cool. There's kind of a rainbow thing
rainbow
above
effect.
you.
I just looked at my own image and saw that. That's interesting. Well, I personally have found a lot of hope in the death doula movement, and feel hopeful that death doulas could help bring hospice back to a place of doing more sacred and spiritual work. And I don't know if that's even realistic, but I'm hoping now that hospices seem to be opening the door a little bit to death doulas, that that can make a significant difference as just a person trained differently who approaches the patient from a different model instead of just the medical model. And do you see that as well?
I see it, yes. And I'm sure that there's a conversation. I just spent time with the social worker staff at the local hospice, and they're already having the conversation of how does the hospice volunteer, who's also a end-of-life doula, how does that get integrated where the patients don't feel like the hospice volunteer is also wearing the other hat and maybe wants to create a business through that very patient. So that's a big question that's happening, I think, even on a national level in hospices. You know, the whole thing is what I love about the end-of-life doula movement is it doesn't have anything to do with government money and insurance money. Unfortunately, that makes it a boutique thing where people that can afford doulas, so it's not for poor people at this time. So I was invited to speak at a big conference in New York City last year in the fall, and it was very much focused on how the end-of-life doula movement is going to get is on the path to get integrated into the medical world and the medical institutions, especially for people, mostly women, because it's mostly a movement of women that want to create a way to make money, to generate money making and turn it into a career. Number of people have done the nurse thing and have kind of, want to again come to their calling and their purpose. And many of these nurses and social workers and therapists, or even doctors, are being drawn to the end-of-life movement, chaplains and ministers as well. The chancy thing about that, again, is when it gets integrated into the medical system, and now you can get insurance money for it, and et cetera. Now it becomes a more regulated thing and another line item on your bill, for the end-of-life doula. And I understand why that movement is happening. I think it's a very fine line where end-of-life doula becomes another specialized expert that gets paid. That's not my emphasis or my work. I think one of the functions of an end-of-life doula is to be a community placeholder, that death is in the community, that death is present, because otherwise you sure don't see it at the malls or the big box stores, and you don't see it on the media much at all. So we're missing out. And as you know, I'm sure, a life without an awareness of death is not a fully lived life.
Exactly. And it's true for our communities. If our communities are not addressing death and dying, we don't have a solid structure for our community if we're leaving that out. And so I have always had the vision of, whether it's death doulas or someone else, that we have these activated, awake people aware of death who in their communities are the ones out there posting flyers on all the bulletin boards in town about death workshop, death cafe, death event, death event, so that wherever people go, they keep seeing death, because there's someone there who's planning events just as you have done, who's holding group meetings and discussions and bringing speakers in, and someone who just consistently offers it to the community, so that everyone who's on the verge of waking up has an opportunity to, because there's someone inspired and passionate there who's going to provide them with the tools and the information they need.
Exactly. You got it. You got to bring it to, that's why I think, I say the death store, there ought to be one next to every Starbucks in America. And I've gotten a little more conservative, and then now I think every other Starbucks would be fine. but some kind of, like it is on Maui, it's a physical placeholder that for lay people and professionals who work in these fields, it's a resource center and a networking place. And that's what it's becoming. And I'm so proud that we're holding that flag here on Maui in a big way, and we'll see the dying center that we're picturing developing on a piece of land here as really as a model for the world of not only training people in the caring of dying and dead people, but in the care of dying and dead people, to have a guest house for the dying, where people that we train are the staff that care for people in a very deep and profound way, and supporting them to not only do the physical and mental and emotional work of completing a life, but as well to support the soul in its transition.
That's beautiful. I like the idea. I was going to ask you that. Do you think there's a place for us to sort of recreate the old vision of hospice in a way? I mean, bringing together people differently trained and setting aside the Medicare and insurance money and doing something really visionary once again in our care for the dying.
Absolutely. I think that's the track we're on. I think a lot of us see that we need, like I was talking to somebody on our show the other day who works inside those institutions to help shift those institutions. And I have so much respect for people who are willing to engage in those systems. We see again and again in hospitals how beautiful and deep-hearted and well-meaning the doctors and nurses and staff are in a broken system. So yes, I do see that many of us are working outside in the edge of the system to bring in the new stories. That's very important work. I mean, you see that happening. Joanna Macy talks about that quite a bit in The Great Turning. That one of what we come out of, one of the responses to what's happening in the world is all these new systems and all the new story of how we teach children, how we school children, how we grow food, how we work with health and living and dying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, how we work out conflicts. All of those new stories that they're not that new necessarily, but they've been often many of them have just been buried for the sake of business.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I wanted to ask you too, because you are also a ceremonialist, I'm thinking about the people who are working inside the system and may not have a choice to get out of the system. I know so many, as you pointed out, mostly nurses who are really suffering, but they believe in the work they're doing. They're working within maybe a for-profit hospice or even a not-for-profit, but they're very stressed. Do you have ideas for how to bring the sacred back to their work? How can we help them rediscover the sacred in the work they're doing within that system? I don't know if you have ceremonies or rituals or ideas for that.
No, that's a great question, and I'm really happy to see that doctors and nurses and social workers and therapists and chaplains and ministers are now coming to our Maui trainings. And so far, that's between my radio show and my column and all the social media parts that I get out there. That's certainly a big part of my message. as far as wide as it gets. I'm not sure, but there's more and more of us that are recognizing that our culture, if it is a culture, is flawed and broken. In fact, it's a death culture. And look what we see acting out in our culture today, on the political landscape, on the gun, random acts of crazy violence. It's breaking down out there. And a lot of people are looking at, why is it breaking down, and what is our response to it breaking down? Which again comes back to why we run into more and more people that are giving up their careers to find what's really meaningful and how to contribute in some way. I mean, I can hear my great grandchildren far off in the distance calling me, and makes my body shiver when I remember that they're asking me a big question, and the question I'm hearing is, "So, Grandpa, in the midst of all of that madness and injustice and horror, when the world in fact was on fire, Grandpa, what were you doing?" And that's as busy as I am, that's my response to the question, is that I don't know if this whole thing's going to last. Sometimes, some days it doesn't look like we're going to go much further in this whole story. But meanwhile, I have grandchildren, and I can hear I can hear their grandchildren, and I'm going to keep putting it out there and planting seeds and working in my garden and seeing what I can do to help my grandchildren, because it looks to me like it may very well be a whole lot worse for them than it is for us before this story's over.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that one thing I've observed in my medical career is that when people are faced with a terminal situation, that seems to be, for many people, the best opportunity they have to wake up and to become more aware of their own spiritual existence and to begin to focus on it and pay attention to it. And I'm hopeful that for our society, it's as if we've been given a terminal diagnosis, and we have this moment of opportunity where we can all collectively wake up and begin to pay attention to what really matters. It's open to us, the possibilities there. Whether or not we can take that or not, I don't know. But
we are certainly a culture that values uncontrolled growth. You as a doctor know that uncontrolled growth is another name for cancer. We are cancer on the planet. But like you said, and I'll bet you've encountered plenty of patients who have a terminal diagnosis and tell you they never felt so alive. Mm-hmm. And so that's another weaving of my work. I want, especially as a minister, to wake people up as soon as possible. And I haven't seen anything wake people up as quickly as a close encounter with death. Is what I call close encounters with death. Either you find out you have a terminal illness, or you find out your best friend just died suddenly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Something happens to almost everybody. And when you describe what happens to almost everybody, and what happens, everybody knows what happens. Everybody gets kind of fragile and raw and in the moment, where there's no room for any bullshit, and very present and precious, and the recognition of what's most important. And that's a spiritual experience. That's mm-hmm. a big spiritual experience. And as a teacher of spiritual practices in a Sufi lineage, I haven't seen anything work as fast as death, close encounter with death.
Yes, whether it's your own terminal illness or the death of a loved one, and being present for that and witnessing it. I still see hope. I still see hope for us if we can respond to this opportunity and the potential for awakening that's there. But I do see, I don't know if you've mentioned it, you did say people younger than 40 now are becoming interested. And so more than just baby boomers. And my children are millennials, and I've noticed that they're very open to talking about death and dying, and they want to know more, and they're interested in learning about it.
Yeah, well, that's cause for hope. That is cause for hope, and I'm with you. Even though it often looks pretty bleak, um, I have a much better time doing what I'm doing with just picturing the most beautiful world for our children and our grandchildren, and keep working on that.
And I don't know if this is an appropriate question to ask, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on this. For those people listening who are sitting in their own communities thinking, I want to make a difference, I want to do something, I want to help the world, I want to change the way people die. Do you have a sense of where should we be putting our energy? Do you have a sense of what could make the biggest impact? Is it people filling out their advanced directive forms? Is it working on more on green burial? Do you have a sense?
Well, in the biggest answer to that question, because people do ask me, and young people come to me who feel fairly hopeless, and what's the point? And the problems are too big. It's so immense, and it is so immense. And how do you find your way into that? It's like I look at my garden, and there's almost so many weeds in my garden. It's almost like where do you start, kind of thing. And what I say is, find out what it is you love, and find out where that meets what the world needs. And that's, those two, if you can, because people say, do what you love. And I said, at this time in the world, that's not enough. Do what you love, but do what you love and have it meet what the world needs. And it's a no-brainer to look around if you want to see somewhere where the world is crying for something. And it could be trees or animals or babies or kids or homeless or dying people or your next door neighbor. You don't have to look far.
So true. And in terms of the end of life realm, it feels to me like now there are more and more places where people can go to get education and support if they want to learn more about death and dying. Just your website alone, all the workshops that you've offered, all the teaching that you've done. And it seems to me, you did mention we're riding a wave, that there is this increased interest, but I feel like there are more and more people out there, partly thanks to your teaching probably, who are spreading the word and setting up their own courses. Do you feel that also? That
there's a number of people that have been pioneers in this for years and years. Jerry Grace Lyons is a great example. Now I see doula trainings and those kind of things springing up everywhere. So that movement is really catching on, and I think a lot of people are seeing that there's a place to plug in. Maybe they've been professional therapists or nurses or on and on and on, and would love to plug their skills into end of life work. It's very much so. I mean, I just heard HBO. I mean, it's either tonight or last night has a new series called Alternate Endings. In fact, somebody told me my name is listed in the thank you credits at the end. Amy Cunningham and a few other people I know are in that. So things are happening. Whether they're happening fast enough and on a big enough level, I don't know. I mean, when there are no more fast food restaurants and the Walmarts go away, and then I might be a little more hopeful and inspired that the shift is really happening. But certainly, maybe the 100th monkey thing really is real, and many more people are tuning to this. Not only the fact that they might die one day and what they might want to do about it, but also as a field that desperately needs a deep people to engage in.
Well, and that leads me back to mention again the International Death Doula training that you're offering every spring in April on Maui. One thing I love about that, not having attended, but having read about it and talked to people who've been there, is bringing together a community of people who are learning together, but also sharing their experiences and their energy. And I would imagine that those groups that form during that 5-day training stay together to some degree or another, stay in touch with each other, that people form friendships and network with people they'll continue to stay connected with, even though they all disperse and go back to their communities. Have you seen that?
No, that's definitely happening. One of the places that we all stay connected is we've got a Facebook group, the doula training Facebook. There's also the Doorway into Light Ministry of Death a group on Facebook that anybody can join. There's a number of great groups on Facebook. The Death Store Doorway into Light is our page. But there's a number of groups out there, Death Hub and Slow Medicine, and there's another, as far as people that go to Facebook, there are a number of groups that are helping people find each other and network. But yes, communities of people developed fairly quickly at our 5-day training from all over the world, really.
Maybe joining that Facebook group, the Death Store training Facebook group, would be a good way for people who are considering the training to get to know some other people and start to feel connected as they look into it and make a decision about whether or not to take part in it.
But the best way would be to go to our website, as you said, doorwayintolight.org, and join our newsletter that comes out every few months to keep up on what we're doing and what we know is going on out there.
And as for your radio show, is that something that's available to people who live anywhere, or is it only available if on Maui in the vicinity?
It streams online at kakufm.org. I think they archive the shows, but it's on Tuesdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Hawaii time if you want to listen live, and it has a call. You can call into the show. It also rebroadcasts Saturday mornings at 9 to 11, again, Hawaii time. Because I play commercial music, which I can legally play on the radio show, but I can't turn that into a podcast. So because it's commercial radio, I play rock and roll. Like the show is Death Tracks, so I tend to break up some of the heavy stuff with some beautiful music. But now the second, it's a 2-hour show, so now I'm turning the second half into the show into music free, and where I tend to do interviews and speak about things. And that one I'm just starting to play with, turning that into an hour podcast that I'll get out there.
Oh, good. So that's wonderful. It's just another way for people to connect with you and learn from you, which is really valuable because you obviously have so much wisdom and so much to share.
Well, thank you. Maybe I do.
Well, I like the idea of the Death Store. I'm hoping maybe we can franchise that and have people opening death stores.
We almost opened one up in San Luis Obispo in California. That almost happened. We were driving around looking at buildings. Then that fell through. Some people have expressed interest in a number of different parts of the U.S., and I'd love to help that happen. That's not my primary emphasis right now. I'd love to help people open up a branch of the Death Store. Not necessarily right now as a franchise, because that's a government, SEC or that's a big thing. And but certainly we can license the use of the name and what it is and what it does, and want to be part of it as well. In fact, that would get me to the mainland more to help support those death stores and help put on events in those communities.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful idea. I personally love the name, the Death Store. You were mentioning, though, that not everyone thought it was a good idea in the beginning to call it.
I think people would have preferred if I called it something like the Till We Meet Again store. But I don't think I could have looked myself in the mirror with a store called the Till We Meet Again store. But it's the D word. That I thought if I was going to change the name of the store, I'd call it the D word store, because it's this whole thing about the car died, the phone died, the dog died, but grandma passes away, and that's part of the problem.
Exactly. You're so right about that. Well, do you have any plans? Do you come to the mainland to speak at any events here? Because I know a lot of events that would probably love to have you.
I was just at the New Mexico, Silver City. We came and taught at a big Sufi retreat, and I did a teaching there. I'm considering it because I'm coming up to the Port Townsend area in October, November time. It's hard to get me out of here because I'm so busy here. I'd rather people come to Maui. It's not doesn't sound horrible to come to Maui.
No.
I know I'm sensitive to getting on an airplane anymore, but I try to make the best use of my time if I'm going to be on an airplane. So I do come out, and people can get me out. I went and taught on Vashon Island last year. People really wanted me to come, so I can be talked into it. Yeah.
All right, good. Because I'd love to see you at more events, but I'd also love to see you in Maui. So I'll put that on my bucket list too.
Please come.
Well, Bodhi, I want to thank you so much for talking with me. The time just flew by. I feel like we need to have several more conversations because there's so many more things we could talk about.
Surely, that's true. That's true, and I really appreciate how you guided this and what was valuable and important for you to speak to and ask about. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I trust that this won't be the only time we get to connect with one another. I would enjoy talking with you again and hopefully meeting in person one day. So until that day comes, wishing you the best of luck and light and love in all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so very much, and wishing you the same. Good health and safe time out there, and may your community recognize how valuable you are and honor you and respect you and appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Bodhi.